A man and woman sit in a near-empty apartment, heating a mysterious and corrosive substance known only as heavy liquid. If you take this stuff and cook it, it turns into black milk. And if you take the black milk and put it inside you, preferably the ear canal, you'll feel impervious. Hello comic book junkies, it's the Frog Queen here, and today I'm going to explain to you why you should read Heavy Liquid by Paul Pope. Heavy Liquid was just re-released on this past June 19th of this year by Image Comics, not Vertigo, on what was basically the 20th anniversary of the serialization, the original serialization of the book. It was originally published by Vertigo. For those who aren't familiar, Vertigo is a DC imprint of some of the most amazing comics of the 80s and 90s, mostly 90s, I think. And it might be actually dead for good, but that's a topic for another video. Heavy Liquid is written and illustrated by one of my favorite comic book creators, Paul Pope. And this book was serialized as a 5-issue limited series when I was in high school, actually. October 1999 to February 2000. I graduated in 2001. I actually have reread Heavy Liquid several times, and it has a lot of rereadability. It's interesting to me, too, that I always get something different from it. So let's just dive into this video. The book was immediately classified as a cyberpunk adventure, but is it really? It has a lot of common themes that many great cyberpunk stories have, including the dystopian world, violent and pessimistic view of the future, and its own seedy underbelly with innovative technology and drugs. Drugs are a really common theme in cyberpunk stories, you see. It is in all kinds of the great stories, from my favorite cyberpunk novel, Vert, by Jeff Noon, to my favorite animation, Rock and Roll. Do you remember those crazy electrical balls that the characters used to get high by holding? Yeah. But unlike these stories, Pope centers his story on a drug which is disguised as something else. It's a substance, and it's addictive when taken into your body, but to the average person, it's not a drug. And this is really interesting because it allows the reader to address the disease of addiction and the nature of that disease rather than focusing on a real substance, and seeing addiction for what it is, a disease. It is my opinion that Heavy Liquid is truly a story about the nature of addiction, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's back up and explain the story. Our story takes us on an adventure with protagonist S, which Pope tells us is S for Stooge. Actually, Pope gives us this little awesome character legend at the beginning of the issue, and I like it when creators do this, although sometimes they intentionally mislead us with these. Pope is actually being genuine. Here we have the main characters all numbered and lettered. As A1, we have S. That's S for Stooge. Why have a name when a letter will do? A hard-boiled dandy or a noir lizard king. He'll be in 2 places at once and cast no shadow. Aren't you tired of anti-heroes? So is S. Next we have 2A, Luna. Poor kid, by the time you figured out how it works, you've already lost about everything you'd hoped to keep. But a smile is a frown turned upside down. Can you still smile? And the stuff, of course. A bizarre metallic substance that's like lava at room temperature. As heavy as a barbell, corrosive to the core. What is this stuff? Where did it come from? What is it supposed to be for? 3A is Crunchy, 3B is Kip, and 3C is Drophead. 3 tough guys who work for a shadowy crime syndicate. They want to flush S's head down a toilet. In their weird costumes, they blend in with all other holiday goofs out there on the street celebrating St. Huck's Day. So S is propositioned by a wealthy art collector who asks him to find a specific artist, a sculptor who he wants to hire to create a sculpture for him. using the mysterious and volatile substance known only as heavy liquid. Coincidentally, the artist S has been asked to find is, in fact, his ex-lover, and it's here that we get a real sense that S's fate is controlled by some higher power. Oh yeah, I'm going there. So if you're a recovering addict, this story could be a bit triggering to you. I'll just give you that quick heads up, depending, I guess, on what your drug of choice is. But there are depictions of S and other characters cooking the heavy liquid, which are reminiscent of cooking drugs. And just something to be aware of. But heavy liquid is not a drug in its original form. This isn't totally apparent until much later in the book. Up until the 20 pages, we, as the reader, are not really sure what heavy liquid is, except that it's a liquidy, unstable metal that can be inserted into your ear once it's cooked up to produce a high-type feeling, and apparently it makes the user feel impervious. I believe I've said this in previous videos, but I do not like stories that glamorize drug use. I do, however, enjoy stories that tell it how it is, and Pope achieved this many times in this story by showing us how our protagonist S is hopelessly addicted to heavy liquid and other substances. And Pope hits on all the main symptoms of addiction. Number one being that S uses heavy liquid and other substances to block out his uneasy feelings. His life is completely controlled by getting and using the substance. Feelings that make him uncomfortable, like negative ones that he had when he thought about his ex-lover leaving him, guilt, loneliness, being the major two that come up repeatedly. S has isolated himself in his addiction. What was once a fun substance that he enjoyed using with his friends actually became his whole life, and in his present state, in the book, he is alone save for one acquaintance that he can't really even call a friend anymore, more like someone he just works with to procure heavy liquid for himself, and you can feel this deep sense of animosity between them in the opening scene. He was once a career man whose experience with addiction had brought him into a life of crime, dealing with thugs and dealers in the underground, and you feel S's hopeless addiction the most when he finally finds his ex-lover and remarks at the signs of life in her home: fresh bought milk, a raincoat, things he no longer has now that he uses regularly. His addiction had brought instability, chaos, and loneliness to his life, and simply things such as taking care of his own basic needs have disappeared entirely, and his focus is on only heavy liquid. He had lost his friends to his addiction, he's lost his loving relationship with someone he cherished, and he lost his livelihood. Hell, the man actually aims to get paid for this finder's gig with the substance he's addicted to, rather than money. Yet what seals the deal for me, making Heavy Liquid more of a story about the struggle of addiction than anything else, is the ending. And this is your big ending spoiler warning. S actually comes face to face with the truth behind Heavy Liquid. It's an alien being contained within the liquid. And now it is inside S. It is projected into the real world as a shadow, which he can see, and it talks to him. It changes how he experiences the world. In fact, other people who are using Heavy Liquid have caught glimpses of the shadow hiding within S. But that's something I'll just leave for a surprise because it's a really good part of the plot. I don't want to completely ruin it here. This climax serves as a revelation to S, who comes literally face to face with his own addiction, and it is only now that you see S truly smile in the book as he accepts his addiction for what it is. Literally, in this case, his addiction is an alien being that talks to him. But what great allegory for addiction! The final scene is a depiction of S on a train smiling face to face with his addiction and moving forward into the future. Something that for S has been wholly stalled. He was caught in the grip of his addiction, caught in a cycle of using and never moving forward. And it is only now, once he sees and accepts what it is that he's faced with, that he's able to look to the future and move ahead. I had a lot of questions about Heavy Liquid over the years, things that popped up in my head every time I read it. So I decided to ask a couple questions from my favorite creator, Paul Pope. And he was so wonderful and answered them. So now I'm going to read that conversation. Hey, Paul, did you base the look of S on Nick Cave? And Paul says, no, he's based on my friend Ray Hansen from a band called The Hypnotics. So that's scratch one for Amy. So I asked him, can we expect any additional content in the new anniversary edition of Heavy Liquid? And Paul said, there's additional color folios of the covers, pinups, and also a section of my thumbnails and pencils. And I asked, can you tell me a bit about where you imagined S to go at the end of the novel? And Paul said, I imagine S goes and gets lost somewhere and learns to communicate with his new companion. I wanted a low-voltage science fiction story that ends with a sense of wonder and innocence after a lot of chaos and pandemonium. I've seen a few reviews complaining that Heavy Liquid seems to have no focused plot or character investment, and that was the point. Real life is chaotic and non-linear. I was inspired by Paul Auster's stories in City of Glass and Bukowski's book Pulp, both of which function as pulp detective fiction, yet throw the genre over to a new, maybe absurdist conclusion. And finally, I said, the fun question, can you tell us a little bit about the process and development of Heavy Liquid? Paul said, I wrote Heavy Liquid while working in Japan. I had a basic script on paper in 1996, believe it or not, and I did some sample pages for my publisher at the time, Kodansha, but the project didn't manifest. A couple years later, I met with DC and Vertigo, and they asked me for a pitch. I retooled Heavy Liquid for a Western audience. The manga version was a lot crazier and more disjointed. It was basically a visceral response to the wide array of manga titles you'd usually see in the weekly magazines, such as Morning or Afternoon. Afternoon was monthly. Just subjects and styles all over the map. For colors, I wanted something unique and not the typical American comic approach. Since the story deals with this pseudo-drug addiction theme, and the story is set in a squalid inner-city metropolis mainly at night, I wanted a color palette to reflect that, so I chose a very acidic red and blue palette. No yellows or greens or warm colors, as if to suggest alienation and warped perception. The new edition has been remastered, and I must say I'm really happy with the final colors for the new edition. It's a really good-looking book. As you can see, I kind of didn't get into the addiction part. I don't know what it is about me. I just can't. I can't ask people about addiction stories. I feel like it's so personal, Anyway, I think this is truly an interesting book which manages to talk about a serious issue that has been present throughout the history of humanity, addiction, while taking us on an adventure in the cyberpunk futuristic world, which is seriously a far from perfect future, and then somehow ends the entire story on a high note where the sky is the limit for our protagonist S. As previously stated, you can get your very own copy of Heavy Liquid in its new format, published by Image Comics today at a comic book store near you. You can also order it online, but go and support your local comic book store. Special thanks to Paul Pope for answering my annoying questions and writing a fantastic book. And until next time, read something good. Oh, and hey, check out my other videos. Tell me what you think. Leave some comments below. I love talking to y'all about comics. It kind of makes my day awesome because I spend a lot of time sick in bed, and it's nice to chit-chat about something that I love.